Star Wars 7x7 episode 3040. Today we're looking at the second of three Ahsoka stories in Tales of the Jedi. This one is Practice Makes Perfect, and it's also tough love in a way as well. Punch it! Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy. And thank you so much for joining me for it. So, Practice Makes Perfect takes place in the early days of the Clone Wars, and I say that because Obi-Wan Kenobi appearing here has his mullet-tastic hairdo. And this is a full spoiler discussion of this episode, by the way. So, we see a bunch of Jedi deciding that Ahsoka is worth watching for the combat trial that she's going through. She's got a bunch of seeker droids that are trying to shoot her, and she's doing quite well defending herself. And then they have these new seeker droids that are supposed to be like battle droids or mimic them somehow. And she's able to defend herself quite well with those. So we've got Mace Windu and Plo Koon and Obi-Wan and Yoda watching this, and Anakin showing up to watch it, but Anakin is not impressed by this at all and says, yeah, this test is lame, and I got a real test for you if you want. And Ahsoka, of course, at this time is like, yeah, okay, I want a real test, like, bring it on. And something I want to flag immediately is Ashley Eckstein, who is doing the voice of Ahsoka Tano, of course. The difference between her performance of Ahsoka in this episode versus in the episode that follows called Resolve, where we have an older Ahsoka Tano who's, it's not that much of a difference, right? It's 3 years comparatively, at least when that episode starts, but it jumps a little later in that episode. The point is that Ashley's vocal performance is just spectacular. She's able to recapture the young and inexperienced Ahsoka Tano voice, and you can hear the difference in the older and more experienced Ahsoka Tano voice. So I think this really also captured Ashley's range. Not that she hasn't been demonstrating it this whole time, but we're also used to an older Ahsoka to a more experienced Ahsoka. You forget what she was like in those early days of the Clone Wars, and Ashley has not forgotten. She is still capturing it wonderfully. So Anakin's idea of training is that clone troopers are even harder to deal with than battle droids, and he's like, yeah, I know I'm being tough on you, but the only way I can protect you for sure is to teach you how to protect yourself. So basically he's got half a dozen clone troopers firing stun blasts at her, and she has to use her lightsaber to defend herself for as long as she can before she gets stunned. And it happens over and over and over and over and over again. Now, my youngest son just started playing football this year, and he hasn't done that, and I've been more than a little nervous about it, and to talk about head injuries and whatnot. And so I'm watching this and seeing Ahsoka crash to the floor over and over again, and I'm thinking, my gosh, her head, she keeps slamming her head on the ground. I wish there was some padding here. I know Anakin probably would have said there's not going to be padding in the real world, but still, this is just, oh gosh, that part was really getting to me. Now, here's the funny thing about this. I think there's a point where there's a time jump in this episode, and they're not necessarily especially clear about it, but the reason why I think that's the case is because for the earlier situations that Ahsoka is defending herself against the clone troopers, she only has one lightsaber. Later on, she's fighting with two lightsabers, and that actually doesn't happen in the Clone Wars until season 3. And whether it's a factor of the practice that she keeps having to go through, or the double lightsabers, or both, once she gets that second lightsaber, she is definitely better able to defend herself, and we see her lasting for quite a while longer. Rex says, oh yeah, it took us 5 minutes for us to finally knock you down at one point, which is pretty remarkable. And it's also shades of the finale of Revenge of the Sith. Not the finale, really, the Order 66 part. That's kind of in the middle. So just in thinking about the idea of clone troopers mercilessly shooting at her, that's exactly what we see when Order 66 gets implemented. And so it does give you that weird echo of oh my gosh, Anakin was training Ahsoka to be able to defend herself from what was going to happen with Order 66, even though he himself was going to be a part of the evil side of that equation. So the irony of that is just striking. And then You know I said this is a full spoiler episode, but I don't want to spoil the ending for you, but I will say that it also gave me chills in a spectacular way, and there's another time jump involved. That's as much as I really want to say about that. And what's also wonderful about this is that it gets the band back together, right? So yeah, we haven't had the main core Clone Wars cast together since, okay, it hasn't been that long, right? Since season 7 of the Clone Wars? Okay. But Matt Lanter, he has said that he never really puts Anakin down, and he gave an interview a couple of years ago where he said, yeah, he's working on some Anakin stuff. This would seem to have been it. And we also had James Arnold Taylor as Obi-Wan and D. Bradley Baker doing Captain Rex and other clone troopers in addition to Ashley. I mean, even hearing Jesse name checked, and Jesse showed up in season 7 of the Clone Wars and he was tortured by Maul during that Siege of Mandalore arc. So yeah, there's little moments like that where you're like, oh wow. And speaking of little moments like that, they're not named in the episode. They have no dialogue, and even the audio description just says a Jedi and her Padawan. But Depa Billaba and Caleb Doom, aka Kanan Jarrus, are in the beginning of this episode watching Ahsoka practice her form against the Seekers and then the battle droid simulating Seekers, right? Aside from Yoda and Obi-Wan and Mace Windu and Plo Koon and Anakin eventually, like, yes, Depa Billaba and Caleb Doom / Kanan Jarrus were in the room as well. And so that was a fun little Easter egg to see. So this one definitely a little more grounded compared to the life and death episode that we talked about yesterday. Perfectly fine. 2 different stories, 2 different ways of telling the story for all intents and purposes. So I did like this one a lot, and I'd love to hear what you thought about it. So please let me know if you're catching this on YouTube. Drop a comment there, and if you're catching this somewhere else on audio, then either the blog post for this show's episode at sw7x7.com or on Twitter, sw7x7 podcast. And that is going to do it for this episode of the show. So it just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for it, as always, and may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
S7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright 2021 by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.